The ink for my signature was still glistening under the fluorescent lights when my brother's wife popped the cork on a bottle of prosecco right there in the conference room. She had brought it in her handbag. She had planned this. My brother Derek was already on his phone texting someone, probably their realtor. Probably already calculating square footage on the lake house he assumed was now exclusively his. I sat very still in my chair and watched them celebrate with the particular patience of someone who knows exactly what is about to happen. The estate attorney's assistant was still collating my signed pages when Derek's phone rang. He glanced at the screen with the lazy confidence of a man expecting congratulations. What he got instead turned his face into something I had never seen before. His attorney's voice came through loud enough for the entire room to hear. "She's got everything. Every conversation. Derek, tell me you didn't say what I think you said on that recording." My brother looked at me across the table. I looked back. I did not blink. Let me go back 14 months, because none of this makes sense without context. My mother was diagnosed with early-onset Alzheimer's on a Wednesday in October. I remember it was a Wednesday because I had just come home from a site inspection in Tacoma and I was still wearing my steel-toed boots when my father called. He said the word diagnosis, the way people say car accident. Blunt. Final. Already in the past tense, even though everything was just beginning. My mother was 59 years old. She had been a middle school librarian for 23 years. She could name every Newbery Medal winner from 1970 onward. Within 6 months, she would struggle to remember which drawer held the silverware. I am a structural engineer. I work for a mid-size firm in Portland that specializes in seismic retrofitting for older residential buildings. My job is to look at foundations and determine whether they will hold. I assess load-bearing walls. I calculate stress tolerances. I read buildings the way other people read faces, looking for the cracks that haven't become failures yet. I mention this because it matters later. It matters because my professional instinct is to examine what's underneath. My brother Derek is 3 years older than me and works in pharmaceutical sales, which means he drives a leased SUV, wears shirts with French cuffs, and describes himself at parties as being in healthcare. His wife Megan coordinates luxury event planning for corporate clients in the Seattle area. Together they project an image of comfortable success that requires, as I would eventually learn, significantly more maintenance than it appears. When my mother's condition began to accelerate, my father needed help. Not eventually. Not theoretically. Immediately. Someone had to be at the house during the day. Someone had to manage the medication schedule, coordinate with the neurologist, handle the insurance appeals when the carrier decided that certain cognitive therapies were elective rather than essential. I filed 4 appeals. I won 3. I rearranged my work schedule to 4 days a week and spent every Friday and most weekends at my parents' house in Lake Oswego. A 35-minute drive from my apartment when traffic cooperated and an hour and 12 minutes when it did not. I made that drive 106 times. I know because I logged my mileage. Derek visited once a month, sometimes twice. He would arrive on a Saturday morning with a bag of pastries from a bakery Megan liked and spend approximately 90 minutes performing the role of devoted son. He would sit beside our mother and hold her hand and speak to her in the slightly elevated voice people use with children and the elderly. He would ask our father if there was anything he needed, and when our father inevitably said they could use help with the medical bills, Derek would nod gravely and say he would look into it. He never looked into it. He never transferred a single dollar. Megan accompanied him on roughly every other visit. Her contribution was to stand in the kitchen, photographing the flower arrangement she had brought, presumably for social media purposes, and to comment with theatrical concern about how exhausting this all must be. She said this to me once while I was on hold with the pharmacy benefits coordinator and I had to physically remove the phone from my ear to process what she had said. Then in March, my father had a heart attack. It was not a massive one, but it was enough. Enough to put him in the hospital for 4 days, enough to require a stent, enough to make it clear that he could no longer manage my mother's care alone even with my help. We hired a home health aide named Grace, and Grace was extraordinary, and Grace cost $4,200 a month after insurance. I paid half. My father paid half from his retirement savings. Derek paid nothing. When I asked him directly whether he could contribute even a portion, He told me that he and Megan were stretched thin with their mortgage and that I should understand that not everyone had the luxury of being single and childless. He said this as though my lack of a husband and children was a financial advantage I had engineered specifically to make him look bad. My father died on a Tuesday in August, 11 months after my mother's diagnosis. Cardiac arrest in his sleep. The doctors said his heart had been under sustained stress. I did not need a medical degree to understand what that meant. He had been managing an impossible situation with inadequate support, and he had run out of capacity. I handled the funeral arrangements. I wrote the obituary. I coordinated with the cemetery and the caterer and the florist and the pastor. Derek delivered the eulogy, which was beautiful and moving and contained several anecdotes I am almost certain he found by searching our father's Facebook page the night before. The conversation about the estate began at the reception, not after the reception, not the following week. At the reception, while guests were still eating finger sandwiches and telling stories about a man whose body was not yet cold, Derek pulled me into our father's study, which still smelled like his aftershave and the leather conditioner he used on his reading chair. Megan was already there. She had a folder. It was a leather portfolio, actually, the kind you buy at a business supply store when you want paperwork to look official. Inside were documents she described as a comprehensive financial assessment of the estate's obligations. There were spreadsheets with color-coded cells. There were printouts from what appeared to be county tax records. There were numbers highlighted in red and yellow with handwritten annotations in the margins. Derek explained in a tone of brotherly concern that our parents' properties, the house in Lake Oswego and a small rental cottage our father had purchased in Cannon Beach 20 years ago, were encumbered by significant tax liens and deferred maintenance obligations. He said the estate was essentially underwater. He said that accepting my share of the inheritance would mean assuming roughly $140,000 in debt. He said that he and Megan had consulted with an estate attorney and were prepared, reluctantly and at great personal sacrifice, to absorb the full liability themselves, rather than see me buried under financial obligations I couldn't afford. He said this while our father's funeral guests were eating lemon bars in the next room. I asked him what he was proposing. He produced a document from the portfolio, an inheritance waiver. Already prepared, already formatted, a pen clipped to the top. I told him I needed time to think. His face tightened in a way that was almost imperceptible, but I have spent my career reading structural stress, and I know what it looks like when something is bearing more weight than it was designed to carry. Over the following 2 weeks, Megan's texts arrived like a weather system. They started gentle. She was just checking in. She wanted to make sure I was okay. She understood how overwhelming all of this must be, and she wanted me to know they were there for me. Then the pressure increased. She mentioned deadlines with the county assessor's office. She forwarded what she said was correspondence from a tax collection agency. She texted me at 11:30 at night to say that Derek was losing sleep over this and couldn't I see what my hesitation was doing to the family. Derek's approach was more direct. He left voicemails that carried the cadence of a man accustomed to closing deals. He used phrases like time-sensitive window and exposure liability and adverse financial consequences. He called the inheritance a burden, and he called his willingness to assume it a gift. I am a structural engineer. I examine foundations. I look for cracks. I started with the tax lien documentation. The numbers looked alarming until I checked them against the actual county records, which are public and free to access online. The liens Derek had cited did not exist. The property tax on the Lake Oswego house was current through the previous year. The Cannon Beach cottage had a small outstanding balance of $1,100, which is not nothing but is also not $140,000. The spreadsheets in Megan's portfolio used figures that appeared to have been generated rather than sourced. The maintenance estimates reference contractors who, when I called them, had no record of ever inspecting either property. I brought the documents to my colleague Brian, who before becoming an engineer had worked as a forensic accountant for a firm that investigated insurance fraud. Brian identified the fabrication pattern within 20 minutes. The numbers were internally consistent, which made them look professional, but they were externally baseless. Every figure was invented. Brian used the word manufactured, and then he used the word deliberate, and then he looked at me over his reading glasses and said, "You should probably talk to a lawyer." I did not talk to a lawyer. Not yet. Instead, I bought a digital audio recorder at an electronics store on Hawthorne Boulevard. It was small enough to fit inside the inner pocket of my jacket. I tested it 3 times in my apartment to make sure it captured conversation clearly at a distance of 6 to 8 feet. Then I called Derek and told him I was ready to discuss the estate. I suggested dinner. He agreed immediately, the way people agree when they believe they're about to get what they want. We met at a restaurant in the Pearl District. Quiet. Good acoustics. The kind of place with cloth napkins and ambient lighting that encourages people to speak freely. Megan came too. She wore a silk blouse and an expression of carefully arranged sympathy. I ordered sparkling water and activated the recorder before the bread arrived. I asked, with measured uncertainty, what would happen if I chose to retain my share and address the tax issues directly through the county assessor. Derek's reaction was immediate and disproportionate. He set his glass down hard enough to make the silverware rattle and leaned across the table and told me that if I disrupted their arrangement, and he used that word, arrangement, he would hire a litigation attorney and sue me for the full cost of every dollar he claimed to have spent supporting our parents during the illness. He said he had receipts. He did not have receipts. He had never spent the money. He told me he would make it public. He told me he would tell our mother's former colleagues and our father's friends that I had abandoned my parents in their final months and was now greedily claiming property I had no moral right to. He said this with the confidence of a man who has never considered the possibility that someone might be recording him. Megan added that she had connections in real estate and could make it very difficult for me to purchase property in the Portland metro area. She said this casually, the way you might mention the weather, and I filed it away. I nodded slowly. I told them I understood. I said I would sign. Derek exhaled. Megan smiled. They ordered dessert. 3 days later, I sat in the conference room of the estate attorney Derek had retained. His name was Mr. Alderman, and his office was on Southwest 3rd Avenue in a building with tinted windows and a lobby that smelled like artificial eucalyptus. Derek sat directly across from me. Megan positioned herself by the door, not casually, strategically. The waiver was already on the table, printed on heavy paper with a pen placed at a precise diagonal across the signature line. Mr. Alderman walked me through the document with the efficient detachment of a man who did not appear to find anything unusual about the proceedings. I asked one question, which I had prepared carefully. I asked whether declining to sign would make me personally liable for the debts Derek had described. Before Mr. Alderman could respond, Derek answered for him. Yes, absolutely. You'd be on the hook for all of it. Megan nodded from her position by the door and added that the tax agency had already initiated preliminary collection proceedings, which was a sentence she had clearly rehearsed. I picked up the pen. I signed every page. I initialed where indicated. I dated the final sheet with a hand that was perfectly steady. Derek shook Mr. Alderman's hand. Megan retrieved the prosecco from her bag. There was the pop of the cork. There was the pouring. There was the particular sound of people celebrating a victory they believe is permanent. I excused myself to use the restroom. In the hallway I had approximately 3 minutes. I used them to upload the audio files. There were 2. The dinner recording and the conference room recording, to a secure cloud folder and to forward the link to the email address of the attorney I had quietly retained the previous week. Her name was Sandra Chen. She practiced estate litigation, and she had a reputation for thoroughness that bordered on surgical. I had found her through Brian, who had found her through a former colleague at the fraud investigation firm. Sandra had reviewed the fabricated documents. Sandra had reviewed the county records. Sandra had read the original trust. Which brings me to the part of this story that my brother never saw coming, because he had never bothered to read our father's trust in its entirety. Our father was a careful man. He was a retired civil engineer, which is where I got the profession, and he built things to last. He had drafted his estate trust with an attorney named Patricia Holbrook, who had included a provision that I suspect my father specifically requested because he understood something about the dynamics of his own family. The provision stated that any named beneficiary who engaged in fraud, coercion, or material misrepresentation against another beneficiary in connection with the administration of the estate would forfeit their claim entirely. The forfeited share would transfer to the remaining beneficiaries. My father had built a load-bearing wall into his trust, and Derek had just walked straight into it. Sandra filed the challenge on a Friday. She attached the audio recordings, the fabricated financial documents, the actual county records, a sworn affidavit from Brian detailing the forensic accounting analysis, and a timeline of Derek's pressure campaign documented through his voicemails and Megan's texts, which I had screenshotted and preserved. Derek's attorney called him approximately 11 minutes after I signed the waiver. I was still in the building. I had returned from the hallway and was standing near the reception desk when I heard the phone ring across the conference room. I watched through the glass partition as Derek answered. I watched the color drain from his face in real time, the way paint thins under solvent. I watched Megan lower her plastic cup of prosecco very slowly, as though sudden movements might make the situation worse. I watched Derek's mouth form the word "what" 3 times in succession, each time quieter than the last. His attorney's voice was not quiet. "She has recordings, Derek. Of dinner. Of today. She has the county records. She has the forensic accountant. She has the trust language. Do you understand what the forfeiture clause means? Tell me you understand what this means." Derek looked up and found me through the glass. I held his gaze for 4 seconds, which is both very short and very long, and then I picked up my bag and walked out through the lobby doors into the August afternoon. The court proceedings took 9 weeks. Sandra presented the evidence methodically. The fabricated tax documents, the actual property records, the audio recordings in which Derek explicitly threatened litigation based on expenses he never incurred and in which Megan threatened professional retaliation. The signed waiver was nullified on grounds of coercive duress and material fraud. Derek's inheritance claim was forfeited under the trust's own provisions, every dollar. Both properties. The Lake Oswego house, where our mother still lived with Grace. The cottage in Cannon Beach, where our father used to sit on the porch and read engineering journals on Sunday mornings. Mr. Alderman received a formal complaint to the Oregon State Bar for his participation in the proceedings. The outcome of that review is still pending as far as I know. I stopped following it because it stopped mattering to me. I did not celebrate. I want to be clear about that because this story invites a reading that I don't think is accurate. What I felt when the ruling came down was not triumph. It was something closer to the feeling you get when you finish a very long drive at night and you turn off the engine and sit in the silence for a moment before going inside. Relief is part of it. Exhaustion is most of it, and underneath both is a sadness that doesn't have a clean name, because it's not about what you lost, it's about what was never there to begin with. I used a portion of the estate to pay off the medical debt I had accumulated during my parents' care. The credit cards, the reduced income from cutting back to 4 days, the half of Grace's salary I had covered for 7 months. I set aside a fund for my mother's continued care. Enough to keep Grace employed and a house maintained for as long as my mother needs it. I put a deposit on a small apartment in a neighborhood in southeast Portland where the coffee shop owners know my order and nobody knows my family. I blocked Derek's number. I blocked Megan's. I did not do this with anger. I did it with the same precision I use when I identify a compromised beam in an old building. You don't hate the beam. You simply recognize that it can no longer be trusted to bear weight, and you remove it from the structure. My therapist told me something during our second session that I have been turning over in my mind ever since. She said that in families, the person who is willing to do the most work often becomes invisible to the people who benefit from it, that the labor becomes expected so gradually that by the time it's taken for granted, the person performing it has lost the ability to see the transition themselves. She said the hardest part isn't recognizing that you've been used. The hardest part is accepting that the people who used you may have genuinely convinced themselves they were being fair. I think about my father's trust sometimes. Not the money or the properties. The forfeiture clause. He put it there because he knew. Maybe not the specifics, not Derek and Megan and the fabricated liens and the prosecco in the conference room, but the shape of it. The general architecture of how things might go wrong. He was an engineer. He understood that structures need protection not just against external forces but against the internal pressures that can pull them apart from within. I visit my mother every Sunday. She doesn't always know who I am. Some days she calls me by her sister's name. Some days, she smiles at me with the polite warmth of a woman meeting a kind stranger. But some days, fewer now but still some, she looks at me and I can see the recognition settle into place behind her eyes, and she says my name. And for a few minutes, the foundation holds. Derek has not visited her once since the ruling. Megan sends a card at Christmas. It is always a card with a pre-printed message and no personal note. Grace puts it on the mantle and my mother looks at it sometimes without recognition, which is, I suppose, its own kind of justice, though I would never use that word out loud. There is a version of this story where I don't buy the recorder, where the exhaustion of 14 months of caregiving dulls my instincts enough that I take Derek's numbers at face value and sign the waiver and drive home and pour myself a glass of wine and tell myself that at least it's over. I think about that version more often than you might expect. Not with fear exactly, more with the kind of careful attention you give to a crack in a foundation that didn't quite become a failure. It's worth studying. It's worth remembering how close the whole thing came to collapsing in the wrong direction. I want to ask you something, and I mean it genuinely. If the people you trusted most were the ones building the case against you, how long do you think it would take you to see it? And once you did, would you have the steadiness to let them believe they had won long enough to prove they hadn't?